And now we're very happy to welcome Rabbi Dan Geffen.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be back. It's wonderful to see all of you, and thank you again for the warm and gracious greeting. And I didn't arrange for this. What a great backdrop to have! You know, all kind of presentations should have beautiful snowing backdrops like this. Um, it's great to be back here, and it's as you said, a rather important topic to consider. One that is certainly not tied to this particular moment in time, but one that certainly has, I think, a greater sense of heaviness or weightiness to it as we consider where we are, certainly as Americans, where we are as part of the human race, and how we consider this really, actually, surprisingly enigmatic idea of what we call power. So aside from trying to be smart looking with my title, I think that actually what I hope to get to is really a discussion about what does this word really mean. And I actually, over the last few months, have really spent a lot of time thinking about how sort of feeling either out of control or out of power and unable to change things. And when I find myself in those situations, what I tend to do is to try to go back to core ideas, right? Core values, get down to the basics of things, because a lot of times we sort of fall into a pattern of overcomplicating things. So with that in mind, I find these days that if there's one benefit of Zoom, that having actually the ability to put things on screen is actually very helpful. But I'll say, for those that are just listening on the phone, nothing will be on the screen that I won't explain, so you're not missing anything in that way. So if it's okay, I'm going to share my screen with everybody. And I only recently learned about this, but there is, I think, a way to have me next to the screen if you so choose. You should see a little green box that says Dan is sharing screen and a little arrow next to it. If that's true, you may be able to choose something that says side by side, in which case you may see me next to. But seeing me, I promise you, is much less important than what I hope I'm going to share with you this morning. So as I said, I titled my talk Toward a More Pragmatic Paradigm of Power. So I'm going to try to explain what I mean by that, and hopefully it won't be too complicated. So let's think about what we would consider common paradigms, and let's define the word paradigm first, which is really a sort of typical example. Not necessarily something that has to be, but something that is a exemplar of a larger concept that helps us to frame our idea of what it is. Okay, so we have lots of different kind of concepts here, which I'll explain very briefly again for those that may be just listening. Power, first of all, we must understand in the world of science, the world of math, is a very significant concept. It's a concept that doesn't have a positive or a negative necessarily, but simply is, right? We define things, for example, the power plug, right? The idea of electricity used to power objects, okay, and the functional necessities of those. We have within mathematics, right, the idea of raising two powers, which without this concept in math, we probably would not, no, we definitely would not be talking to each other this morning, okay? So conceptually, we have these ideas outside of any social construct, so to speak. We also have identities of power that can be attached both to individual and to collective, right? So the seal of the President of the United States carries with it a tremendous amount of abstractly understood power. The gentleman at the bottom, who any of you who've watched the Game of Thrones shows on HBO may recognize as a guy named the Mountain for good reason, is power lifting what is an outrageous amount of weight, right? Demonstrating the capacity for human beings and many animals to demonstrate what we would call raw power, right? The capacity to either lift or push some amount of a heavy object, and what that ultimately in our minds generally leads to, okay? We also have, I picked an artist representation just because I love this painting probably more than anything else, right? The Great Wave of Kanagawa. But the natural world is probably the greatest example of power, because it is the kind of power that can overwhelm even the most stout human interaction, right? The power of a wave, the power of a hurricane, the power of wind, all of these kinds of things are all powerful objects, each with the capacity to completely terraform and change whatever it is they come into contact with. And then, as this is a joking nod, probably mostly to me and Keelan, right, to our childhoods, and this is probably a little bit after mine, these are the Power Rangers in case you don't recognize them. But ultimately, this also falls into the category of what we would describe as sort of superheroes of mythology, the idea of power beyond what a normal human being is capable of, and what results from those powers. And you usually have those powers in the hands of quote unquote good guys and quote unquote bad guys. Okay, so what do all of these paradigms ultimately show us? The mathematical pieces, they're abstracts, right? They're on pieces of paper or in lines of code. We don't really think about those in really, I think, everyday specific kind of ways. They're really background understandings of what power is. The center ideas here, right, of both individual human beings and collective are quite significant in our day-to-day lives because, again, we see this, at least a perception in our mind that somebody who is physically strong is equated with powerful. And, for example, the leader of a country which is in possession of a greater amount of financial means, military means, political means, is a more powerful country than a smaller country that does not possess those same kinds of things. And then ultimately we have, as I said, in the natural world and in the supernatural world, we have examples of power that go beyond, frankly, our ability to comprehend, not because we can't see them, but because we can't really actually even imagine to be in possession of that kind of power. So here are our sort of common ideas of it. And now to get a little more, both abstract and less so, right, is to identify the fact that power on its nature, right, if we're going to identify qualities to it, can be generative, right? As you see here, while we may have certain conversations about what is actually powering these lights and how we are getting to that power, right, the idea that it is possible for human beings to light up the light's sky, right, by all these means, demonstrates the positive capacities of power, right? All of us who are sitting here on our computer right now benefit from the idea that there is this stuff surging through the walls, and most of us don't really understand that somehow allows us to be warm, to be fed, and to be able to meaningfully interact with each other even when a pandemic is going on. But we also know on the opposite side that power can be unbelievably destructive, especially when it is wielded as the purpose of a weapon, right? One that is then used to project power or to dominate another people. And certainly this is a provocative image, and it's not chosen by accident. Okay, this is probably the singular example, or the two bombs that were dropped are the singular examples, at least at this point, in which human life was taken on such a grand scale. And again, one can argue the positives and negatives, the reasons why, the reasons not to, but it's simply as a matter of fact, right? Understanding the sheer power of an atomic weapon and what it can do reminds us of the other side of power. Okay, and what it can do to destroy as much as to build. So then, Mr. Smart Rabbi, as they say, what exactly is power and how are we to define it? Okay, I'm going to try as best as I can because I'm a rabbi. I like to bring in something Jewish when I see you guys, and this is not new. I may have even brought this into a previous conversation before, a section of Jewish wisdom that's called Pirkei Avot, which translated different kinds of ways, but sort of handed down ethics from generations past. And so what it ultimately says, right, this is one of the rabbis, his name is Ben Zoma, and he says, who is a powerful person, right? Who is powerful? Those who can subdue their evil inclination. In other words, to at least push down that thing that happens to all of us, and I mean all of us, okay, where we start to feel like we need to do something aggressive, negative, pushing of other people, when that thing bubbles up in us and we begin to get angry, right? And then the next step from anger is usually to exert some form of power. Okay, so Ben Zoma teaches us that actually the most powerful is not the one who exerts it, but the one who restricts it, right? Who holds back from it. Okay, one that is slow to anger is more powerful, and quite frankly, more powerful even than someone who is to overtake an entire city. Okay, so this, again, may seem like a simple thing. We're all nodding our heads in agreement. But you must remember, when the rabbis are writing this, this is a collection of wisdom that may have pre-existed the Mishnah, but the Mishnaic period is about 200 CE. Okay, so we're talking about, not quite 2,000 years ago, but pretty close to. And again, the inherited knowledge may be that old. Okay, so in that time period, think about, right, the superpowers of the world, right? The Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Greeks, the Romans, right? Here you have the Jewish people who are fairly tiny in number, who have already been essentially depossessed of their land and dispersed all over the world. That's when the rabbis are writing this. They are not by any means in anything resembling a quote unquote position of power. They don't have a military. They don't have their own administration. They don't have self-determination in most cases. So there is a radical rethinking of this concept of what power actually means. And then in fact, the most powerful examples of people who are really, really powerful, at least according to this understanding, are the ones who know that they're powerful, who know that they can exert power and yet actively suppress the desire to do so, especially to do so, as it indicates here, for the purposes of evil, right? For the purposes of doing harm. In other words, the restriction of power as a destructive force and the amplification of power as a constructing force in the world. So now I'm going to shift many generations later, and again, not an unfamiliar person for me to teach. I think even to you guys, I've brought Rabbi Heschel's teachings before. Just a reminder, again, that he was a significant rabbi just within Judaism, certainly over the last 100 years, but also became probably the most significant figure of the Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement. And the first time that he meets and becomes very dear friends with Martin Luther King, Dr. King, and the work that they did from that point forward begins in 1963 at a conference that is called the Conference on Religion and Race. And so he delivers this speech and he begins as follows, and I have to just hide my thumbnail thing here so I can see it. He says, at the first conference on religion and race, and he's sort of doing this tongue in cheek, right? The main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. Moses' words were, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go that they may celebrate a feast to me. While Pharaoh retorted, who is the Lord that I should heed this voice and let Israel go? I don't know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go. The outcome of that summit meeting has not come to an end. Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate. The Exodus began, but is far from having been completed. In fact, it was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than for a Black person to cross certain university campuses. And again, this is in 1963. Let us dodge no issues. Let us yield no inch to bigotry. Let us make no compromise with callousness. Now, these words in and of themselves are very powerful. It's worth reading the entirety of the speech. It's worth reading King's speech. So many things happen because of this one event that actually not that many people necessarily know about. But why am I bringing this conversation into our conversation ultimately about power? It brings in a few very important points, again, speaking somewhat from the Jewish perspective, but I think ultimately ending in a universal kind of understanding, which is, what is the story really of the Exodus? How does it begin? It begins, first of all, by challenging the power of the time, right? Pharaoh decides to enslave an entire people and not let them leave. And so Moses, on behalf of God, goes and speaks, as they say, right? It's oftentimes quoted these days, truth to power, okay? Standing up to. So remember, Moses himself, even though his background is royal, right? He grew up in the household. He's a pretty normal guy. It's so much so, in fact, that actually he doesn't want to be in the job. He tells God that he has a speech impediment, that he's not a good person to speak. He is the opposite of what we would describe as a paradigm of traditional power. He doesn't march into the Pharaoh's throne with an army behind him. He does not tower over. He does not take up throw down a gauntlet and decide to have a one-on-one duel with the Pharaoh to show who is the manlier man or the more powerful, right? That's not what's really taking place here. What's taking place here is an argument over what is the nature of power and how is it wielded, and the improperness of Pharaoh's decision to exert his tremendous power over a powerless people. And I think, again, part of the reason why the story of the Exodus becomes a touchstone story that is used throughout the civil rights movement and to this day, and really through many other examples throughout history, is because it's one of these great paradigms of the example really turning sort of on its head the idea of what a power structure is and how it can be manipulated and how it can be cruel and how it can be used to destroy. And just as easily, how one simply rethinking the idea of power, right, being less concerned with physical ability, less concerned with military ability, less concerned with destructive ability, and instead saying, what is Moses really ultimately saying coming in? I want to empower my people to be able to go and live their life according to the way that their tradition tells them that they ought to, okay? I'm going to do everything I can to create that sense, again, of a proper power structure in which there isn't a single person ruling over a mass, but instead a group of people who are able to draw together and to create change as a result of it. And ultimately, Heschel's piece at the end is also very important, which is a reminder that, right, he's speaking obviously euphemistically. He's not talking about the Exodus, but he's talking about the reality that the same kinds of struggles play out throughout human history. What he's talking about in 1963, with the simple fact, right, of people of a different skin color to be able to study next to each other, to be able to walk across a college campus, right, without being either threatened or actually physically attacked, let alone by the police, right? He's talking about this constant challenge that we as human beings have had about understanding and being aware of the times in which power is abused. So what do I think is the answer, right? What is a more pragmatic paradigm of power? Well, one thing I was thinking about, and this is not an absolute by any means, right? We can't redefine a word that has by its nature a definition that implies strength or overwhelming nature, right? Power is still power. But we can change the way that we think about it and we apply it. That's where the paradigmatic piece comes in, okay? And in particular, where the pragmatic paradigmatic piece comes in, okay? One in which we can realistically think about an application that is going to be much wider than narrower, is to stop focusing so much on power as a noun, right? To exert power, to establish power, to control power, to project power, to wield power, right? To think about it less as a thing to possess or to hold on to or to limit, and instead think of power as into power, right? Verb, create a greater emphasis on the idea of what does it mean to give power to others, right? One of the great fallacies, I think, ultimately, and I think I can probably pull back from the screen share at this point, the great fallacies, I think, of power is the idea that it is finite, right? That we have to control it and we have to limit it and we have to keep it only in the hands of some, and we can fill in the blank as to why, right? There's all sorts of rationalizations we can use to do that. And I think, look, none of us have to stretch our minds very far to think about this in contemporary terms, right? To think about this in terms of our country, in terms of what happens with our elected leadership and how they conceive of this idea of power. But it doesn't have to just be that, as I think I've done many times when I've spoken with this group, and I say it to my own temple as well. Part of the work starts here, right? Part of the work starts in our own homes, in our own relationships, in our own community, right? How do we define and conceive of this word power? And how we do that and how we apply it, and in particular, how we create paradigms that we are working towards, right? Ideal manifestations of, is by really getting down to the brass tacks of trying to understand what do we mean when we use this word. And I think that's one of the great things about this group, and by having these themes as you do each month, is it gives a real opportunity, probably more so than most people have in a week-to-week daily kind of basis, to really drill down into these ideas and these concepts and to think about where we fit into this structure, right? Every single one of us on this call, and I'm saying this to each and every one of you, to myself as well, each of us is powerful. Each of us possesses power. There is no question about that. It's by definition. It's just a question oftentimes of, do we understand what that power is? Do we understand how to use it? And do we understand ultimately why we would use it? And I think that's where we go back to the teaching from Pirkei, which is to understand that even the best of us with the best of intentions can allow sometimes the evil inclination in us to abuse power. It's perhaps the most abused concept in the world, if you think about it. And as I said, the most potential possessed to create good, or the most potential to create destruction on a scale that is really unfathomable, right? The power of nature is out of our control. The power of God is out of our control, but the power of humanity is very much in our hands. And what we do with it is ultimately what's going to define us as a human race. And unfortunately, our history is one that has proven time and time again that when given the opportunity, power will be used and wielded like a cudgel. So the question is, how are we individually, collectively, right, as a human race, how are we going to change this paradigm and to create really a different means by which to understand this word power? And I think perhaps more than anything else, if we could just change this idea within our, human family, our way of thinking about power, I think it could have the greatest potential impact of anything else that we could change as a people. So I hope that some of these ideas made some kind of sense. As always, I never know, especially in a Zoom world, I really have no idea until after the fact. But I appreciate, actually, really very genuinely, I appreciate the invitations to come and speak, because oftentimes it forces me to really sit down and to confront my preconceptions about an idea. When I'm given the task, the first step is to really sit down and say, what do I think about this? And is my thinking on this really where it needs to be? And I think, actually, to be honest with you, I have a lot of thinking left to do. This has really started something for me, not ended it. So with that, I wish you really, first and foremost, my gratitude. And second, my hopes that every one of you and your loved ones will continue to be safe and healthy, and for us to remain the optimistic group that we are, that we will get to better places. And we will do that simply by beginning in moments like this, just sharing the opportunity to learn and to teach and to smile and to laugh and perhaps to tear up a little bit. And really, I look forward to the next time I can come back. So thank you again for the time.